The confrontation begins, a hearing turned reckoning. What unfolded in that committee room was not a routine exchange, nor was it the kind of choreographed political theater that Washington has become numb to. No, what you witnessed was something altogether different. It was a moment when the veneer ripped away, when the niceties dissolved, and when a member of Congress, Representative Jasmine Crockett, decided that enough was enough. She wasn't there to posture. She wasn't there to extend diplomatic courtesies. She was there to expose the truth, unvarnished, unapologetic, and unrestrained. And the object of that truth-telling was Kash Patel, the man occupying the most sensitive domestic security role in the federal government, acting director of the FBI. But the question that framed her entire line of attack wasn't political, it wasn't partisan, it wasn't even personal. It was institutional, it was existential, it was about legitimacy. What qualifies someone to lead the FBI? What kind of experience must a person have? What kind of judgment, grounding, training, and reliability must someone possess before being entrusted with protecting a nation of 330 million people? For nearly every FBI director in history, the prerequisites were clear, years if not decades inside the Bureau. Inside law enforcement, inside counterintelligence, or national security. People who worked their way up. People who knew the stakes because they lived them. Patel, none of that. No background in the FBI, no service within the Bureau, no institutional knowledge, no deep professional roots, no grounding in the culture, norms or values of the agency he was suddenly put in charge of. It wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. And Crockett made sure the American public knew it. She didn't whisper it. She didn't imply it. She laid it out plainly. You are the least qualified FBI director in the history of the FBI. Not hyperbole, not dramatic flourish. A fact, and Patel's reaction said everything. He didn't rebut her with credentials. He didn't counter her with a record of achievements, or a list of operations he oversaw, or the number of agents he trained, or the years of service he accumulated. Instead, he reacted like someone who isn't used to accountability, someone who expects deference, not scrutiny. Someone placed in a role not because they earned it, but because they were chosen for their obedience. Crockett understood this dynamic long before she began speaking. Her opening wasn't just commentary, it was context. She reminded the room and the nation that Patel wasn't the product of a merit-based system. He was the result of the Trump administration's long-running assault on institutional expertise. The same administration that installed loyalists in positions meant to be insulated from political influence. The same administration that dismantled career leadership in favor of ideological loyalty tests. Patel was a symbol, not an outlier. But Crockett didn't stop at symbolism. She moved to consequences, real ones. Consequences measured not in political points but in human lives, in democratic stability, and in the safety of elected officials who are increasingly targeted by domestic extremists. Crockett reframed the conversation around the lived reality of America today. Threats rising, violence escalating, lawmakers, Republicans included, receiving death threats from far-right extremists. She listed example after example, each entered into the record without objection, each demonstrating that the threat is neither theoretical nor partisan. Yet Patel refuses to name the primary source of domestic terrorism in the United States, white supremacist extremism. And that refusal is not neutral. It's dangerous. Crockett reminded the room that even Patel's own public statements minimized the realities career officials, analysts, and field agents have been reporting for years. She forced him to confront the disconnect between his public performance and the actual threats facing the American public. And when Patel tried to deflect responsibility or pretend ignorance, Crockett pushed harder. She wasn't there to debate. She wasn't there to negotiate. She was there to expose. And exposure is exactly what she accomplished, dissecting Patel's record. A catalog of leadership collapse. What Representative Jasmine Crockett did next was something most politicians never even attempt. She dismantled an official's record piece by piece, failure by failure, fact by fact, without hiding behind jargon or letting the weight of the moment dilute her clarity. She treated Patel's record not as a collection of bureaucratic decisions, but as the direct evidence of institutional decay. First, she highlighted Patel's behavior even before confirmation targeting career officials for removal, pushing out people whose experience and expertise were necessary to maintain continuity within one of the most complex law enforcement agencies in the world. This wasn't speculation, it was documented behavior. Patel's purge of seasoned professionals didn't just weaken the Bureau, it destabilized entire operational divisions, leaving gaps in counterterrorism, cybersecurity, domestic intelligence, and public corruption investigations. It sent a message: loyalty mattered more than performance. Obedience mattered more than expertise. Crockett emphasized that the very investigations Patel became publicly frustrated with the ones involving Trump and his allies originated not from political opponents but from the FBI director handpicked by Trump himself, Christopher Wray. The cases weren't partisan, they were institutional. They came through standard channels, triggered by evidence, validated by agents, and supported by career prosecutors. Yet Patel treated them as political affronts, aligning himself with the very behavior the FBI is supposed to resist. But Crockett didn't stop at early failures. She drilled into Patel's current leadership crisis. She confronted him with his own admission that the FBI is so understaffed, under-resourced, and mismanaged under his leadership that it could take 14 years to reach full operational capacity. 14 years, nearly 3 presidential administrations before the Bureau could function at the level the American public expects from it today. That statistic alone should have triggered alarm bells across the country. But instead of focusing on rebuilding capacity, Patel was redirecting resources to functions outside the FBI's traditional mandate, essentially turning federal agents into de facto immigration enforcement officers, pulling them away from specialized training and away from investigations that actually target threats to national security. Crockett layered her critique with precision. She reminded Patel and, more importantly, the public that even when it came to his own friends, Patel's leadership was sloppy. His double-posted victory laps on social media weren't signs of confidence. They were signs of desperation. Signs of someone who needed to be seen as competent because the work itself did not demonstrate competence. And even in that celebrated case, it was the parents, not the FBI, who turned in their child. The suspect openly confessed online. Yet the Bureau still struggled. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern of mismanagement, misprioritization, and misdirection. Crockett connected these failures to real harms. HBCUs receiving bomb threats without serious federal attention. Black communities feeling abandoned because the FBI would not call white supremacist violence what it is. Members of Congress receiving death threats, yet having no faith the Bureau would protect them. Crockett's message was clear. You cannot lead what you do not understand. And Patel does not understand the FBI. The threat landscape. What Patel refuses to see to understand the magnitude of what Representative Jasmine Crockett did in that room. You have to understand the deeper tension underlying her entire interrogation, the gulf between the reality of threats facing the United States and the fantasy version of that reality that Kash Patel continues to project. What Crockett exposed was not only Patel's personal incompetence, but something even more dangerous: his deliberate refusal to acknowledge the forces tearing at the country from within. For years now, intelligence assessments from DHS, from the FBI's own analysts, from independent counterterrorism experts have been clear and consistent. The most lethal domestic threat in the United States comes from right-wing extremism, specifically white supremacist violence. This isn't a political statement, it's a statistical one. It's backed by the data. The majority of politically motivated killings, mass casualty plots, hate crimes, and extremist-driven violence originate from the far right. Yet under Patel's leadership, the FBI has not only failed to center this threat, it has actively minimized it. And this is where Crockett's voice shook the entire architecture of the hearing. She didn't approach the conversation theoretically. She approached it as someone who lives with the consequences. She spoke as a black woman, as a member of Congress who has experienced targeted hate, As someone who has colleagues who have faced death threats so credible, so graphic, so relentless that they required police protection, security upgrades, and in some cases, forced exits from public life, she reminded Patel that this isn't a matter of political narrative, it's a matter of physical safety. Real people are being hunted by extremists who believe violence is justified. Real lawmakers who voted against Jim Jordan for Speaker were inundated with death threats. One Republican colleague had such dire threats against his wife that she slept with a firearm next to her pillow. Others received anonymous calls promising violence if they did not bend to the will of extremists. And yet, Patel refuses to name the threat. Crockett's examples weren't random, they were strategic. By using Republicans as case studies, she removed any partisan framing Patel could hide behind. She made it undeniable. Far-right extremism is not a democratic. Talking pointed is a national security crisis affecting members of both parties, but Patel's silence, his hesitation, his inability to even speak the words white supremacist violence, revealed something fundamental. He is not neutral. He is not blind to the threat. He's choosing not to acknowledge it, and this is where Crockett's commentary cut deepest. Because when law enforcement refuses to acknowledge a threat, that threat grows, it festers, it spreads. It gains momentum and confidence. White supremacists do not interpret the FBI's silence as restraint. They interpret it as permission. Crockett highlighted that even after domestic terrorists targeted HBCU's historic institutions that have shaped Black intellectual life in America for more than a century, the FBI said nothing. No press conference, no urgent briefing, no public assurance, no concrete plan. Silence. Imagine that. Black students receiving bomb threats, evacuating dorms, fearing for their lives, and the nation's top domestic security official has no comment. No mobilization. No urgency, nothing. Crockett didn't need to raise her voice for the indictment to land. The weight of her lived reality did the work for her. Then she expanded her point. Children being shot, community members killed in there. Churches, hate crime survivors begging for federal action. The pattern was unmistakable. And the FBI's refusal to confront white supremacy has left communities across the country questioning whether they matter in the eyes of the people sworn to protect them. What Crockett made painfully clear was that Patel is not failing because he is ignorant. He is failing because he is aligned with a worldview that strategically ignores the deadliest threat to American democracy. She exposed how Patel reallocates resources away from extremism and toward political priorities, how he strips the Bureau of experienced agents who specialize in countering racial violence, how he dismisses intelligence reports that contradict his ideological leanings, how he consistently presents white supremacist violence as a marginal issue rather than the core danger it is. But Crockett didn't stop with naming the failures. She connected them to accountability, to legitimacy, to the core question: if the FBI's director will not acknowledge the biggest source of domestic terrorism in America, how can he be trusted to fight it? She made clear that Patel is not simply unqualified, he is unwilling. Unwilling to confront extremists who support the political movement that elevated him. Unwilling to risk backlash from the far-right factions he quietly caters to. Unwilling to defend the members of Congress he is supposed to protect, and in doing so, Crockett revealed something profound. A democracy cannot survive when its chief law enforcement officer refuses to recognize its most dangerous enemies. The threat is not theoretical, it is measurable. It is growing. It is targeting elected officials, minority communities, and public institutions. Yet Patel continues to operate as though naming the threat is more dangerous than the threat itself. This is why Crockett's interrogation wasn't just powerful, it was necessary. She reminded the country that oversight is not a formality, it is a safeguard. It is one of the only tools left when institutions begin to erode from within. And she delivered a message Patel could not escape: you cannot protect a country you refuse to see. The hollowing of institutions, how competence was replaced with loyalty. To fully appreciate the force of Jasmine Crockett's takedown, you have to step back and look at the broader architecture of what she exposed. Because this isn't just about one man sitting in a hearing room, blinking under fluorescent lights, scrambling to defend the indefensible. This is about a years-long campaign to hollow out the very institutions meant to safeguard American democracy. Crockett's interrogation wasn't simply an attack on Patel's capabilities, it was a historical reminder of how we got here. She connected Patel's failures to a systemic project that began long before this hearing, a project that didn't emerge by accident but by intention. Under the Trump administration, a new measure for public service appointments began to take root, not expertise, not professionalism, not ethical judgment, but loyalty. Personal loyalty, ideological loyalty, loyalty to a political figure rather than to the Constitution. Patel is not an anomaly in this system. He's the end product of it. Crockett made that connection explicit. She reminded viewers that the Trump administration repeatedly undermined career professionals, driving out seasoned experts and replacing them with individuals whose qualifications were secondary to their willingness to obey. She pointed out that Patel's appointment came from the same administration that tried to weaponize the Justice Department, demanded investigations into political rivals, pressured officials to overturn elections, and repeatedly attempted to convert impartial institutions into tools of personal power. Patel wasn't hired to run the FBI, he was hired to control it, and this is why Crockett's critique stung with such resonance. She exposed that the Bureau is not simply mismanaged, it has been ideologically re-engineered from the inside out. She outlined how Patel targeted long-serving FBI officials before he was even confirmed, singling out career employees for dismissal. The message was unmistakable. Experience was a liability. Institutional memory was an obstacle. Independence was a threat. He wanted people who would follow orders, not people who understood the mission. He wanted loyalty above competence. And he acted accordingly. Crockett pulled this pattern apart methodically. She underscored how Patel stripped away the very people who carried the Bureau through times of crisis, agents who spent decades dismantling extremist networks, analyzing domestic threats, infiltrating hate groups, and understanding the nuances of radicalization. These weren't paper pushers. They were the backbone of the FBI's counterterrorism apparatus, and Patel pushed them out. Replacing decades of expertise with political loyalty doesn't just weaken an institution, it rewires it, Crockett made this clear. When the top of an agency becomes politicized, every level underneath suffers. Decisions become distorted, priorities shift, investigations stall, morale collapses. The country becomes less safe, not because threats grow stronger, but because the people in charge choose not to confront them. Crockett's voice sharpened as she walked through example after example. Patel's decision to redirect FBI agents to act as immigration enforcers didn't happen in isolation. It was part of a broader ideological push to recast national security through a political lens. Instead of targeting the threats identified by intelligence analysts, Patel redirected resources to align with political talking points about immigration, even when those assignments pulled agents away from ongoing extremist cases. She made the room feel the absurdity, the FBI director claiming he cannot fully staff the Bureau for 14 years while simultaneously moving trained agents into roles outside their expertise. It wasn't a staffing crisis, it was a leadership choice. Crockett exposed how this hollowing out created blind spots, dangerous blind spots. When you purge experts and replace them with loyalists, you don't just weaken the institution. You lose the ability to respond to crises effectively. You lose the ability to anticipate threats. You lose the ability to uphold the rule of law. She showed how Patel's desperate social media victory laps weren't signs of accomplishment, but signs of insecurity, an attempt to create an illusion of competency where none existed. When an agency relies on public relations spin instead of operational results, it's a sign of internal decay. Then Crockett pulled the camera back even further. She connected Patel's incompetence to the lived consequences. HBCUs left unprotected, black communities ignored, Republican lawmakers receiving threats without confidence the Bureau would act. She pointed out that Patel's failures aren't contained within bureaucratic walls, they spill into the real world, where real people live with the fallout. And here is where Crockett's critique transcended politics and approached something more profound. She wasn't simply arguing that Patel was unqualified, she was arguing that America is watching. In real time, the degradation of the very institutions designed to uphold democracy. She framed Patel as a symbol of an era in which institutions are no longer led by their best, but by their most loyal. An era in which expertise is discarded, oversight is resented, and competence is treated as a threat to political power. She showed viewers that the danger is not only in what Patel has done, but in what his appointment represents, the normalization of unqualified leadership in places where qualifications are not optional. Crockett's analysis was more than criticism, it was a warning. A warning that once institutions fall into the hands of those who do not respect them, rebuilding them is not simple. Restoration takes decades, trust takes generations. Damage can become permanent. In her voice you could hear it, the frustration, the urgency, the fatigue of someone watching an institution built over a century being slowly dismantled by a man whose primary credential is his willingness to say yes to the people who put him there. What Crockett exposed is that Patel is not simply a bad leader. He is the embodiment of a dangerous trend, the installation of political foot soldiers into the highest levels of government, where their failures don't just reflect poorly on them, they destabilize the nation. And that is why her confrontation mattered. She wasn't fighting just one man. She was fighting the erosion of the rule of law itself. A reckoning in real time, why Crockett's confrontation will be remembered. What made Jasmine Crockett's confrontation with Kash Patel so unforgettable is not that it was loud or dramatic or emotionally charged, though it had all of those elements. What made it historic was that it revealed with clinical precision how democratic institutions crumble from the inside when accountability is stripped away and replaced by loyalty, fear, and silence. The hearing wasn't just contentious, it was clarifying. It showed the country what happens when an institution as essential as the FBI is led by someone who neither understands its purpose nor respects its obligations. Crockett didn't expose Patel's weakness out of political instinct. She exposed it because it was unavoidable. His record, his conduct, his evasiveness, every part of his leadership reflected something deeply broken, and she knew that millions of Americans needed to see it in the final stretch of her critique. Crockett wasn't merely documenting Patel's failures. She was telling the country what it looks like when the rule of law is replaced with rule by performance. When law enforcement becomes an extension of political power rather than a defender of public safety. When institutions stop protecting people and start protecting those who control them, her message was unmistakable. This is what institutional decay looks like in real time. Patel didn't just stumble when confronted, he folded. He reacted not like a director with command over his agency, but like a political appointee unaccustomed to scrutiny. Every time Crockett cited a fact, Patel attempted to pivot. Every time she listed an example, he attempted to dilute it. But Crockett anticipated every evasion. She had studied the pattern. She understood that Patel's greatest vulnerability wasn't merely incompetence, it was the truth, and so she forced the truth into daylight in a way he could not escape. But the power of her interrogation went beyond exposing Patel himself. What Crockett did intentionally or not was build a public record. A record that future committees, future lawmakers, future journalists, and future historians will return to when they trace how the justice system lost its integrity and who allowed it to happen. Crockett created a roadmap of Patel's failures. Failure of competence, the only director with no FBI experience, failure of resource management, shifting agents to political priorities, failure of transparency, misrepresenting, staffing, misreporting arrests, failure of moral clarity, refusing to name white supremacist extremism, failure of duty, ignoring threats to members of Congress, failure of protection, silence during attacks on HBCUs, failure of credibility, grandstanding while cases collapsed, failure of leadership, purging expertise to preserve loyalty. Crockett wasn't speculating. She was documenting, and that documentation was essential, because the country is living through a moment where truth is constantly destabilized, reframed, or buried. Crockett understood that hearings are not just for lawmakers, they are for the record. They are for the public. They are for the courts of history. Her confrontation served as a counterweight to the erosion of truth, but the most powerful part of the confrontation, what will be remembered long after Patel's name is forgotten, is that Crockett grounded her argument in the real people harmed by his leadership. She spoke about HBCU students who received bomb threats while the FBI remained silent. She spoke about lawmakers, Republicans included, who received death threats so credible they armed their families for protection. She spoke about black communities who face the brunt of extremist violence while Patel refuses to even acknowledge who is responsible for most of it. She spoke about children targeted in acts of hate while the nation's top law enforcement official prioritizes political assignments over public safety. These aren't abstract failures. They are failures that put lives at risk, and Crockett made one thing painfully clear: institutions don't collapse all at once. They collapse because people in power stop doing their jobs. Patel is not the cause of institutional decay. He is the symptom. A symptom of a government that replaced experts with loyalists. A symptom of a bureaucracy reshaped for political benefit. A symptom of a justice system expected to bend, not uphold. A symptom of a philosophy that values obedience over qualification. Crockett's role in this moment was not to simply criticize him, it was to expose the philosophy he represents, one that rewards allegiance to political figures over duty to the Constitution. That's why she didn't pull back. That's why she didn't cushion her critique. That's why she didn't perform civility for the sake of optics. She wasn't speaking for sound bites, she was speaking for survival. For the survival of a system that depends on accountability to function. At the end of her confrontation, Crockett did something essential. She reminded the country that oversight isn't just a political ritual. It's one of the only tools left when institutions drift toward authoritarian control. Her interrogation: was democracy defending itself not with weapons, not with power, but with truth, clarity, and courage? And that is why the moment mattered. Patel looked unprepared, defensive, and exposed because he was. Not because of Crockett's tone, but because the facts themselves are damning. Crockett's voice simply gave them form. When future generations study this era, they will look back on moments like this hearing as inflection points, moments when someone refused to let dishonesty pass unchallenged, when someone insisted on documenting the failures others wanted to ignore, when someone demanded that the truth be spoken into the record even if it shook the room. Crockett didn't just confront Patel, she warned the country. She modeled accountability. She defended the role of truth in democracy. She showed what oversight looks like when done with conviction, and she left a message ringing through the chamber. If you cannot protect the people you serve, you do not deserve the position you hold. That is the line history will remember.